On my first read of Song of Ice and Fire, I remember being quite surprised by how important House Greyjoy is to the story overall. They start out in the first book as mostly tertiary mentions. The only character we know from this house is Theon, who's a ward of House Stark, and a sort of not blood brother to Robb Stark. Pretty fun relationship there. A Clash of Kings rolls along. We have Theon coming in as a viewpoint character. He has many chapters throughout this book. He has an interesting arc of separating himself from Robb and trying to reclaim his Ironborn heritage, and that going quite terribly. A Storm of Swords happens, and we have no Ironborn perspectives and no idea what's going on the Iron Islands, save for a few mentions and a few chapters that are mostly unrelated to them. We hear of Balin's death, but Theon is assumed dead at this point. We don't see his torture like we do in the show. We just see him vanish in A Clash of Kings, and oh, he's probably dead in A Storm of Swords. Then A Feast for Crows. There are 3 new Ironborn viewpoints in this book, bringing our total up to 4 and making the Greyjoys the second most populous house of viewpoint characters, behind only the Starks. The Lannisters don't count with the Kevin epilogue, so they're still at 3. These chapters continue throughout Feast and Dance, where all of the Greyjoys play pretty substantial roles in the plot and each of their individual stories. I think that the Greyjoys are an incredibly interesting house, as I think that they have one commonality, one shared trait that really just makes them interesting to discuss, that I really haven't seen other people talk about in the past. That being that I think that all 4 members of House Greyjoy who are viewpoints in the main series, those being Theon, Asha, Victarion, and Euron, are defined by the trauma that lingers in their past and in their present. For those who either haven't read the books in a while and don't remember because they're pretty late game, or just haven't read the books at all, the viewpoints from House Greyjoy are as follows, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. Theon, obviously, ward of House Stark. He becomes prisoner of the Boltons later on, yada yada, Theon. Asha is also in the show. They changed her name to Yara to avoid confusion with Osha, the wildling, who Martin really likes in the show, but she's overall mostly the same. She's definitely a little smarter in the books. I think that show Yara kind of picked up a little bit of her uncle, who we'll get into in a second here. But yeah, overall, I think the character's better in the books, but overall, mostly similar. Euron is technically in the show, but he has pretty much nothing to do. He's a priest of the drowned god. He was initially kind of a party boy and pretty much a typical Greyjoy, but eventually he ends up falling over a ship and nearly drowning and being reborn in essentially his faith to the drowned god. His chapters are called things like The Prophet and The Forsaken because they are entirely focused on Euron's religion for the most part. Victarion is the final and my favorite of the Greyjoy viewpoints. He is Theon and Asha's uncle, as is Euron. I forget if I said that or not. Victarion is dumb as a stump, according to the author, George R. R. Martin, and his viewpoint chapters are very fun because he's a very bad temper. He is great at warfare and bad at pretty much everything else. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel, and I really appreciate it. And I'd love to hear your opinion on this video and this topic in the comments, and what else you'd want to see me discuss about A Song of Ice and Fire or the Greyjoys in the future of this channel. Back to the video. I think that all of these characters are very interesting, and they tend to be defined by some sort of trauma in their past or in their presence. I think that this is something that a lot of characters in A Song of Ice and Fire feel, but I think the Greyjoys, more than anyone else, kind of centralize this feeling as it pervades all of their viewpoint chapters. We see that 3 of them seem to have the same abuser, and one of them is unique, that being Theon with Ramsay. It seems like Asha, Victarion, and Euron are all affected by the actions of their brother Euron, as he pretty directly abuses at least 2 of them and causes traumatic and stressful events in the present for the other one. But I think that the main element and way that this trauma pervades their story is the fact that I think that each of them represents one of the 4 typical trauma responses in a person. I should explain this concept, and shout out to the YouTuber My Little Thought Tree for helping out on this, because I'm not a therapist. I don't know a ton about psychology, but I was able to consult with research for this video with him, and I really appreciate it. Check out his channel. But anyway, the easiest way to think about this is something called the window of tolerance. It's a concept that a guy named Dan Siegel invented. Essentially, it goes as follows. So all of us undergo stresses in our day-to-day lives, and all of us have an amount that we can tolerate. This window of tolerance essentially is how much we can tolerate. If we get more than that, we spike outside of our window, and we are forced to respond to this trauma in some way. That trauma response tends to take one of 4 forms, at least in terms of modern schools of thought. There are some who think there's a fifth, there are some who think there's a sixth, but overall, these four tend to be the main kind of tent poles of ways in which individuals respond to trauma falling outside of their window of tolerance, those being fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. I'm pretty confident you've heard of at least two of these. Fight and flight are obviously the stereotypical responses to anything stressful or traumatic happening, most notably, like, oh, if you get into a little scrape at the bar or something similar. These two are pretty on the nose in terms of their actual meaning. The other two require a little more explanation, but I should explain all of them just for posterity's sake. Fight causes an individual to lash out at those around them in response to stress or trauma. They can come off as intimidating or a bully or overall just kind of too aggressive for any given situation. Additionally, flight is kind of the opposite side of that coin. Rather than lashing out and trying to attack whatever is attacking you, you try to disengage as quickly as possible and just get away from whatever is causing you an issue. It essentially results in a lot of panic and individuals just not being able to really think about the situation, so they just disengage, get away from it, no matter what, at all costs. The other two, freeze and fawn, are a little bit less common in terms of discussion, so I think they bear a little bit of explanation for their definitions. Freeze is kind of self-explanatory. This one has happened to me in certain situations in my life, but you can just lock up, tense entirely, and not really be able to do anything if confronted with too much stress or too much trauma. It can lead to disassociation, and that freeze might not just apply to you physically. It could apply to your thoughts, your decision making, and other similar elements. The final one is the most abstract, and I think the most interesting. I hadn't heard of it until I think I watched a TikTok on Succession, which is a very good show. But Fawn is quite fascinating. It essentially involves you're not running away, you're not freezing, you're not fighting. Instead, you are trying to placiate, you're trying to make good with whoever is causing you this stress or this trauma. It can cause confusion with your identity because this is something that is so just bad for you, but you are trying to still embrace it and embrace the person causing it. And additionally, it can create tendencies of being a people pleaser or just overall being too focused on the individual who is causing you trauma. I think that in looking at all of these, it becomes apparent which Greyjoy might slot into each of them, but I'm going to go through each of them now and discuss exactly how this influences them. Victarion is an interesting case. His trauma with Euron isn't always framed as trauma. If anything, it's kind of framed as a joke in a way that the other three really don't have. Insofar as his trauma from Euron comes not from childhood, not from the present, but from the kind of medium recent past. Euron assaulted his wife and slept with her, and this resulted in Victarion killing his wife because he viewed it as a big dishonor. He thinks that Euron made him kill his wife, which I mean, I don't really think that's a good way to think about it, but this is what resulted in Euron being banished from the Iron Islands before he eventually returns in A Feast for Crows. This trauma isn't as direct as some of the other trauma that we'll get into later, but we do see Victarion very much carry it with him and this burning resentment and hatred of Euron, as well as it seems like he very much embodies the fight response. When we think about the fight response and lashing out, I really can't think of anybody who lashes out more than Victarion Greyjoy. I think that a lot of his issues with Euron, in addition to just being about his wife, deal with him feeling inferior to his younger brother. We hear throughout the books that he has issues with feeling dumber than those around him because he is dumber than those around him. Most notably that he hates laughter because he always feels like he's the butt of a joke, which is, I mean, understandable, especially for a character who's a little bit slower like Victarion. And I think that we see his reactions to it pretty directly. Specifically, someone makes a joke because Victarion says he's going to sail the Dothraki Sea, which is actually a grassland. This guy makes a joke, and then Victarion kills him with a single, lifted chokehold, almost like a force choke, but not really, since he's actually doing the choking himself. I think that we see Victarion just overall be made to feel powerless by this trauma inflicted upon him, either by Euron or to a lesser extent by those around him for correctly assuming that he's very dumb. But I think that in Lashing Out, he very much exemplifies the fight response of the typical trauma responses. Asha's an interesting case. Not only do we not think she has much to do with Euron in her childhood because he was banished for most of her childhood, it is interesting to consider that her trauma is much more recent, at least in terms of coming from this one particular abuser. When I was first considering this video, I thought, oh, Asha probably won't work for this. She'll probably just fit into fight as well. And while she does tend towards fighting in terms of just interpersonal conflict, we see her fly whenever conflict turns to real. Specifically, the main action we see her take in A Dance with Dragons is in the aftermath of losing the Kingsmoot to Euron, she flees to the north. She flees to Deepwood Mont, where she decides to claim her holdings there rather than be shackled to this new husband on the Iron Islands. Were she to fight, that would probably involve, I don't know, getting away from this husband and remaining on the Iron Islands and rallying support there, instead of just bouncing and going to this land that she'd conquered a decently long time ago and going back there to avoid any confrontation with other individuals. We see her continue this pattern of flight when confronted with Stannis Baratheon and his armor and army, not just armor, in A Dance with Dragons, and it is interesting to see how that pans out for her in that specific book. In Stannis' attack on Deepwood Mont and the battle that follows, Asha breaks her foot, which is quite interesting. We don't hear a lot about broken bones of point of view characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I think this injury very much goes to limit Asha's typical method of trauma response and very much push her to the limit. I think it happens to Victarion too, as we see his wound on his hand get infected, and that kind of impacts his fighting ability and very much stifles his typical trauma response. His hand is injured, so he's unable to fight as well when he is pushed to the limit, when he's pushed outside of his window of tolerance. Asha sees the same thing. Her foot is broken. She is no longer able to flee whenever she is pushed outside of her window of tolerance. And this ends up putting her in a lot of new and disadvantageous situations. Specifically, she's captured by Stannis and ends up having to march alongside him for the later half of A Dance with Dragons, which is a very interesting portion of the book for her and for Stannis, and it very much seems to be kind of causing her to think in a way that she really hasn't had to before, as she is acting much more diplomatically than we've seen her do in the past. And it seems as though she's going to have to stand and fight if the Asha fragment, which is the only hint of her in the Winds of Winter we currently have, is to be believed, as that chapter puts her in the middle of the Battle of Ice, fighting for her life. We're now getting into even darker trauma from the Greyjoy, so I will give warning for any sensitive topics that might come up in these next two sections, so be a little wary of that. But I think that the trauma of Aeron Greyjoy is perhaps the most heartbreaking of all of these. Theon is up there as well. But Aeron was assaulted by his brother Euron when they were both children. Euron was a fair bit older than him, and we hear throughout Aeron's chapters, even as early as A Feast for Crows, this kind of worry and this echoing in his head of the scream of a rusted hinge. This was the hinge of the door to his childhood bedroom when Euron would come and visit him, as we learn in the Forsaken sample chapter of The Winds of Winter. This is something that obviously is going to stay with Aeron his entire life, and we see him respond to it in a number of ways over that time. First, he ends up getting drunk a lot and being a party boy, but later he ends up turning to religion and overall just devoting himself to his faith to a degree we really don't see from any other character in the series, even Melisandre, I'd say. This is pretty typical of a freeze trauma response. When an individual is kind of pushed outside of their window of tolerance and they have the freeze response, they can have trouble concretely forming an identity, and they might just latch on to whatever is kind of happening at that time. It's worth noting that both of these identities that Aeron had, the party boy and the religious figure, were formed in reaction to some sort of direct trauma. The party boy stuff was most likely in direct response to Euron's actions towards him in childhood, and the religious awakening only comes on the heels of Aeron's brush with death in Balon Greyjoy's rebellion. It's also worth noting that characteristic of the freeze response is the inability to make decisions, and the entire conflict in the Iron Islands is sort of rooted in Aeron not being able to make a decision. All of the people surrounding him want him to rule the Iron Islands after the passing of his brother Balon. He wants Victarion to rule the Iron Islands, but he's incapable of just saying, oh, I should rule the Iron Islands, or Victarion should rule the Iron Islands. Instead, he thinks there should be a Kingsmoot. He can't make the decision, so those around him have to. And it's that that leads to even further trauma for him. It's that leads to Euron taking power in the Iron Islands, and it's that leads to his imprisonment by his brother that we see to be quite traumatic via just terrible conditions and kind of psychotropic drug trips in the Forsaken chapter of The Winds of Winter. So I think if we're talking about trauma responses, Aeron is probably the best example we get out of the Greyjoys, specifically for the freeze response. Aeron Greyjoy, similarly to Victarion and to Asha, is placed into a pretty extreme situation. This time it's a little bit different, though. Both Victarion and Asha have their typical methods of getting out of a situation or of dealing with trauma removed, with the injuries to their hand and foot, respectively. Aaron is captured by Euron and imprisoned on his ship, the Silence. In this sense, he is kind of forced to freeze. He is stuck as who he is and just stuck in place entirely. He's frozen in time almost, as we haven't seen him since A Feast for Crows, and he's just been chilling in the boughs of the Silence ever since, albeit chilling in kind of a less pleasant sense than most. This essentially changes one element of his trauma response insofar as he's less able to cloak himself in his faith than before, as Euron gives him shade of the evening, this drug that induces these hallucinations, and he sees the death of numerous gods and Euron's ascension to some sort of divine throne. This takes away Aeron's ability to form an identity in response to any trauma, as this faith is kind of taken away from him, as he views himself as forsaken, as the chapter title implies. With that said, he does still seem to be sticking to his faith guns at the moment as of the end of that chapter, but I do think that will likely change if and when he receives another chapter in the Winds of Winter. Theon is last on the chopping block here, and his torture by Ramsay is quite different in the books. Like I said earlier, we don't actually see it. He is absent for A Storm of Swords and A Feast for Crows. Many readers assumed he's dead. It's actually kind of spoiled by Martin that he's not in a blog post before A Dance with Dragons publication, but that's neither here nor there. His torture by Ramsay is very much happening during the course of the present story, so it's not childhood or past trauma like Aeron or like Victarion. It is worth noting, though, that Theon is very much defined by memory issues, and this has led some people to believe that maybe Euron played a similar role in his childhood as he did to Aeron. That said, there isn't much evidence for that outside of Theon's memory issues, which could be explained by a number of other things. I do think that the torture that Theon undergoes by Ramsay in the books is quite worse than what he undergoes in the show. Most notably, his hair turns entirely white. He's missing several fingers and several toes, and while we don't quite know whether or not he was castrated as he was in the show, it is very much hinted towards in the books, so I tend to think that, yeah, he was. So the torture was very much worse, to the point where he very much can't operate a bow he talks about in A Dance with Dragons. I think that Fawn response is very typical of Theon, as we see him entirely erase his identity for the sake of avoiding further wrath from Ramsay. However, I will say that it's unclear as to whether or not this is Theon's typical trauma response. In the show, it seems like Ramsay very much forced him into responding trauma in this way, whereas I think that in the books it's a lot more ambiguous. I do think it does speak to his character as a whole, as I think that Theon is someone who's always struggled with identity formation, and I think that it very much reflects someone who does have this trauma with knowing who they are. We see him attempt to mold himself into being a Stark of Winterfell. We see him attempting to mold himself into his father's ideal version of a Greyjoy in Clash. And then we see him molding himself into Reek for Theon, not for Theon, for Ramsay in The Dance with Dragons. All of this is designed to please people who have in some way or another traumatized him. Ned Stark beat his father in a war that resulted in two of his brothers being killed and kidnapped him. His father, Balon, was terrible to him, and Ramsay obviously abused him with, the torture that doesn't really get more explicit than that. But I do think that it very much speaks to this loss of identity and this just trying to please the individuals who have traumatized you. However, we do see another change of circumstance in the Winds of Winter for Theon, as he is, at this point, captured by Stannis, someone who really isn't ever pleased. So this is another situation where individuals might not be able to go through with their typical trauma response, as it just doesn't seem to work in the present circumstance. All four individuals who are part of House Greyjoy act as central characters for the future of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's fun to note that all of these characters were initially supposed to be in a mega prologue for A Feast for Crows before eventually being expanded into a larger part of the story. I've talked in the past about Victarion being unable to die, and I think that part of it is this interesting element of his character. I think that all four Greyjoy viewpoints are specifically designed to remark on the different ways in which individuals respond to trauma and the different points in life where trauma can emerge for different individuals. I think that Martin has done an excellent job at that, as it is something that has affected so many people in the real world, and I think that it does it's great for individuals in our world to have individuals they can identify with in fantasy stories or just in stories in general. I talked a lot in the past about being able to identify with disabled characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and while I'm not as affected by trauma as any of these Greyjoys, I do think that it's great to have that as an element of the story for individuals who are greatly affected by trauma in their own lives. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. It helps grow the channel. It's free, and I'd love to talk more about A Song of Ice and Fire and similar issues to this in the very near future. House of the Dragons recently ended, so we're going to be back talking about the books a fair bit, so join me for that. It'll be a fun time. I think my next video will probably be a Winter is Coming video, so stay tuned for that. I wonder who it'll be. And I'm excited to share with you in the very near future. Thank you again for watching, folks, and I will see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.